All right, everyone. Hello. It is officially noon here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So it's time to say good afternoon, although we recognize it is possibly good morning, good middle of the night, or good evening, depending on where you are tuning in from across the world. Welcome to this edition of PON Live from the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. I'm Nicole Bryant, the managing director here at the Program on Negotiation, and we are delighted to welcome all of our participants joining us today for this edition of PON Live featuring Jim Sebenius and Alex Green, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But first, if there are any new folks to the Program on Negotiation, we are the world's leading research group for over 40 years now on topics related to negotiation, mediation, and conflict resolution. And we are very pleased to put on this series of free public webinars, which we host over the course of our academic year. If you would like to share this webinar with someone else, it will be recorded and posted to our website in just a couple of days. If you need to drop off and you have to finish it later, that's perfectly fine. Also, you can also view all of our past recordings, which are free and available on the PON website. So please stay tuned for that. As ever, before we get started, I'd love to thank the incredible PON staff who does so much work behind the scenes getting all of these events scheduled. I was commenting to them before this that we have events literally coming into my inbox right now, and our calendar is filling up for the spring. So we are really delighted and thankful for all the hard work that they've put in. Shout out to Laura San Pietro, Riley Schretzel, and Luis Reyes for all of their hard work. And with that, I will turn to today's presentation, which will take place over the course of an hour. We will have about 40 minutes of presentation from our speakers, followed by a 20-minute Q&A session. If you have a question at any point in time, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will endeavor to get to as many questions as possible at the conclusion of our session. And with that, I'm delighted to present today's event and speakers, which features the content that originally came out in an article in the Negotiation Journal. The Negotiation Journal is the Program on Negotiations scholarly research journal, which is both for academics, practitioners, and those who are interested in the topic of negotiation. So today's discussion stems out of an article there, and I'm pleased to say that this article, like everything in the Negotiation Journal, has been for about 2 years now made free and accessible to anyone on the public. We have links in the chat to the journal, which is published at MIT Press, as well as to the specific article in question, A Tale of Two Cities, Amazon HQ2 negotiations in New York and Virginia. What better speakers today than Jim Sebenius and Alex Green, who I'll invite to come on screen now. Jim Sebenius is a vice chair of practice-focused research here at the Program on Negotiation, as well as a longtime tenured faculty member at Harvard Business School. At PON, he chairs our Great Negotiator program and is also the editor of the Negotiation Journal, so a well-placed person to discuss the many merits of this journal. And he's joined by Alex Green, who is a lecturer at Harvard Kennedy School and a longtime PON affiliate and has written many cases and articles on great negotiators, secretaries of state, and other important figures in the PON orbit. So we are really delighted. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. I'm going to cede the Zoom floor to you for the next 40 minutes, and I'll come back on to moderate questions. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Nicole. Very happy to join and welcome people to this event of PON Live, where Alex and I are going to talk through some research that we did that culminated in case studies and the article that Nicole mentioned in the Negotiation Journal. We cribbed a title from Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, which has a little more literary merit, but ours may be just a bit more applicable to people facing challenging decisions with lots of stakeholders and some real merits, but some real questions. And so that's really the subject of how what we'll be talking about. A few years ago, we noticed that Amazon, which of course is headquartered in Seattle, wanted to come up with a second headquarters. And they looked around, and of course, that as a matter of economic development would be a huge prize for any city, state, or region to have the other headquarters. It would represent tens of thousands of very high-paying jobs. It would represent billions, literally, of economic development directly and indirectly. And so this desirable prize was basically bid for. A contest was held, and 238 cities in both the US and a few in Canada and Mexico made a pitch as to why they were the right place for the second Amazon headquarters. And, it was there was sort of a no holds barred competition, but ultimately the selection, uh, instead of a second headquarters by itself, they decided to have two headquarters and two second headquarters, if you will. And so it turned out that there were two ultimately successful cities in Queens in New York and Crystal City in Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. But the story of that, which I condensed into the what happened at the surface level, I think conceals a whole lot more. And what Alex and I are going to do is sort of talk you through that process and some of the lessons that we think can be drawn that are of broader applicability, but also in we hope to entice you to read a fuller account that you'll find in the most recent issue of the Negotiation Journal, along with a number of other things. I would say that one of the things that really distinguishes in the Negotiation Journal, and full disclosure, I'm the editor in chief, as sometimes people refer to me, but I'm just basically the editor. And we try to generate high quality intellectual capital that's valuable in practice. And by practice, I mean effective diagnoses or understandings of difficult situations and good prescription about what you should do, what various protagonists should do, if there's a third party, a mediator, there are other bystanding stakeholders, how they should most effectively act to lead to an outcome that's collectively productive and ideally sustainable. So that's a high level version of what we do or hope to do, but this is an example of what we think we can learn. And I'm going to turn it over to Alex in just a second, but this is a rather unusual opportunity. We had written a detailed case study on the Amazon headquarters effort in New York, and it was enormously desirable from the point of view of New York, which competed and won against 238 other cities that wanted it. And, for lots and lots of reasons that Alex will go into. But, and he'll tell you kind of the denouement of that. But perhaps ironically, there was, because of some of the friction in New York, Amazon decided to split their second headquarters. And so there was HQ1, headquarters one or headquarters A, if you will, in Queens, New York, and a big competition for where the B headquarters would be. And that turned out to ultimately be in Crystal City. In each case, Amazon had to negotiate, as these are large, complex projects with lots of stakeholders. And their approach in New York was very, very different from that in Crystal City. So we have an unusual opportunity. Normally, when you look at a single negotiation, it's an N, a sample, if you will, of one. And it's got some interesting things, and implicitly you can compare it to lots of other possibilities, but it's hard to generalize from a single example. But here we have roughly comparable situation. You've got Amazon negotiating headquarters in Queens in New York and in Crystal City in Northern Virginia. Now, obviously, there are plenty of differences, but this is the same company dealing with the same kind of project on two East Coast cities at the same time. And that's a lot of comparability that you normally don't have to be able to compare and draw inferences, compare and contrast on case studies. Of course, you've got the background of all your other knowledge, but that's it. So that's kind of that's the story. And Alex is going to primarily take you through the New York story. And then I'll spend some time on the Crystal City story. We'll go back and forth and probably interrupt each other as we go through. Because this is not a sequential set of monologues. But let's go from there. Alex, take her away. You might even tell people you should shamelessly plug your new book, which has won some really prestigious awards, even though that doesn't directly have to do with negotiation.
It's very kind. It's about an entirely more dour subject of disability history called Perfect Turmoil. Thank you so much, and it is up for an award this year, which is wild with the National Book Critics Circle. But this story in and of itself, I'm going to start, yeah, I guess on a dour end of its own, which is the New York side of this story. And thanks so much, and good afternoon, everybody. And like Jim said, we're going to go back and forth through this whole thing. There's a lot of details in this. Try to give you a sense of what the flavor of the article itself has contained in it, but it's a very rich story, which is kind of why it needed also an article version. And I think, one thing is that because this is Amazon and because the players are so big, you've got Long Island City in Queens and New York, and you've got Virginia, Crystal City on the edge of DC. It's very easy to see why this might be an exceptional case. But I think within it, as you've noted, Jim, a lot, like there are really key aspects where what New York did in particular in responding to the offer to have a second headquarters for Amazon in Long Island City is really quite common for commercial negotiation and something that you could see yourselves very easily mapping out, I think, and end up doing, only to find that there are consequences that can be avoided by really thinking through a different negotiating process and a different way of setting things up away from the table. Just to map this out really quickly, put yourself in this setting. It's 2017. It's September of 2017, and Amazon puts this out, and the requirements are kind of wild for this, right? The fact that 238 cities put in for this is amazing. You've got an offer of 50,000 jobs potentially for an urban area that wins this. Later, that's split into 25,000 each is what's on offer. Those are going to have about an average of $150,000 per job. But the requirements for this mean that you have to be near a major airport. You got to have 8 million square feet of commercial real estate available to on offer. You have to a population of more than 1 million people and significant transit infrastructure. And so, despite those parameters, cities leapt at this, and New York was one of the leading bidders to put in a bid. And the way this worked is that the whole process took place over about a year and a half period. Um, the 238 cities and metropolitan areas put in their bids with Amazon, and each kind of organized it their own way in their own states. And that list was winnowed down to about 220 in early 2018. And at that point, Amazon announced there would be 20 finalists, and then in November of 2018, almost a year later, they winnowed that down to two finalists. They announced two separate headquarters. And New York City, Long Island City, an area within Queens that was fairly underdeveloped, was one of the areas that they decided on. So the backdrop to that is a fairly straightforward process. Governor Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo at the time, and Mayor Bill de Blasio led the process of putting forward a plan to Amazon. And that plan, like so many of the plans that were put forward, was incentive based. So many people were leaping at the idea that they wanted to welcome Amazon in by offering financial incentives to them. The plan for Long Island City was about $3 billion. But that had some details to it. Jim, that was not unusual, right? 3 billion for the.
No. So a lot of bespoke elements in a pitch of this kind, that fit to the neighborhood and the community and what they see the particular needs of the company are. So there's a spec sheet as to here's what we need, but there's a lot of flexibility within it.
And am I right? Like that 3 billion would only come in if Amazon, which had just become $1 trillion company, this is a huge deal, brought in it's 27 billion in earnings or tax revenue to the area over the next number of
Years,
years. Is
yeah.
that right?
Yeah. And then, but it would collectively be about $3 billion in tax revenue, added tax revenue, in addition to the 25,000 jobs, all of which, ultimately would have paid well in excess of 150K. So it was pretty attractive. And, obviously the construction trades to build this and others, there were, a lot of benefits to a lot of parties. Of course, they came with questions too, because you put a whole bunch of people in one place in a even relatively uncrowded part of New York, and you'll have issues of infrastructure and crowding and traffic and all sorts of stuff that comes up, as well as plenty of people who don't take kindly to Amazon.
That's right, right. And I think that there's an unlucky portion of this on timing, and then just an overarching point that would, I think, apply in any moment in a negotiation, right? Because they do the traditional thing. They decide that they're going to pick Long Island City as one of the locations. They announce Long Island City is going to be one of those locations, and then they decide that if there are any concerns, they'll defend themselves against that. And I know that decide, announce, defend thing is gonna come back into this in a little bit. But of course, in November 2018, you have the announcement of these two headquarters locations, Crystal City, Virginia, and Long Island City. But you also have in Queens, right where the Long Island City location is going to be, the election of a seismic figure in political shifts in modern American politics, which is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is elected in that area. And a mass movement of people kind of deliver her to her election. And she becomes a kind of galvanizing figure in this announcement that seems to blindside a lot of people, right? This comes out of the blue. It's not the announcement is quickly on the defense in general from a lot of fronts, right?
Yeah, and Amazon thought it was going to be smooth sailing because you had the governor, the mayor of New York City, and a public poll that said 70% of people were in favor of this. So they just figured it was all set.
That's it. And that number is really striking, right? 70% is really worth keeping in mind because the polling was supposed to be this buttress, this bulwark against any fears that there would be opposition. But of course, there was opposition right away. And I think so much of it boiled down to we weren't consulted. We weren't consulted. We didn't feel asked. We weren't brought in. So very quickly, you had a large coalition of people who had just organized to elect a new politician to the area representing them, feeling fiercely like they need to defend that. And it gets out of control pretty quickly, right? The teachers union says, well, where's some tax money coming into this? The labor unions start saying, well, Amazon doesn't have a track record that we love on labor unions. Amazon has brought in $11 billion that year, and they haven't paid any taxes after on those earnings.
Their
And
net profit is $11 billion, but their federal taxes at that year, for various reasons, were zero.
we're zero. And this becomes obviously optically very, 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 very bad.
Not to mention that the world's richest man is behind all of this at the time that AOC has just been elected, and you get the sense.
You get the sense. And I think lost within all of that, I think the biggest thing that stood out to me from this research was the fact that the local coalition partners, especially the political partners, felt that they had not been consulted. New York City is massive, right? And you have everything from the city council all the way down to local commissions and boards that control zoning and neighborhood affairs. And everybody, there's kind of a zeitgeist that comes up there saying, we were not consulted about this. And that starts to really snowball on Cuomo and de Blasio. Doesn't help also that that sets off journalists. And so there's an investigation in the Wall Street Journal that probably most damningly shows that a bunch of Amazon executives have bought property nearby the proposed location in advance of the announcement. And so this is turning against them very, very swiftly. And I think the nail in the coffin that really proved to me that this coalitional support from within the political realm was so important and overlooked was that this needed approval from a very powerful board in the state Senate. And a new head of the state Senate was appointed, and she was very much against this deal and was ultimately placed on that board, which effectively said that anything that needed statewide approval or city approvals was not going to go through. And at that point, we're now into 2019, and in February 2019, this second headquarters of the second headquarters is nixed by Amazon, and they ultimately back away from having announced this plan, and they scuttle it. And I think that alone provides a really arresting case, right? It's a really important case study for us to focus on about what it means to unilaterally declare something and what moves you probably should do away from the table before you start doing something like this. But I think what we hadn't expected was this story in Crystal City that you dove into, and I think
and I'd like to add one thing to the
please,
New York story, which is you know, this was very much of a mixed blessing because it was a huge amount of construction jobs, a lot of very high paying other jobs. There's just, as a matter of economic development and employment and income and taxes, it was a huge windfall, probably the largest you could almost imagine. And and so, yes, there was a lot of pushback. And I think Amazon and Jeff Bezos in particular just felt almost wounded by this because they were offering a gift. And after all, 238 cities had begged for this, and New York finally won, and it had been among the supplicants. So, like, what is this?
And the
And
incentives were not unusual either, right? Like by and large, the vast majority of municipalities, states, regions that offered proposals, for better and for worse, put in a lot of incentives because they believed in this broader impact that having so many more people employed would bring. So
yeah,
it's not also like it was a very unusual thing.
what was also interesting, though, is, after a while, Amazon just said, we really want to go to a place where we're welcome and we think we're bringing a lot of value and jobs and taxes and development. But, if you don't want us, okay. And which actually triggered a huge counter reaction and a letter published in the New York Times signed by all these people who had vociferously sort of opposed it, or so Amazon understood. They tried to backtrack a little bit and say, well, we were just, making sure that it would have the right set of conditions and so forth. Please, oh, please, oh, please reconsider. And Bezos sort of said, no. And
And,
so,
and of course, the head of the project kind of summed this up from New York. Their head of development for this saying, right, it should have been what should have been a coronation became a coronary.
yeah. So, I mean, it was a negotiation that did not work out. And, people can debate whether it's right or wrong. But so then you face, we have that, one case. And frankly, that was a really interesting case. We wrote a case study on it, taught it, a lot of lessons about how to avoid things. Alex mentioned a process that Amazon used that is sort of referred to as decide, announce, defend, which is, decide on queens, announce it, say what you're going to do, and then deal with the objections. Sounds pretty sensible, but when there are a lot of stakeholders involved, those of us in the negotiation world sometimes say, if, decide, announce, defend, which is sort of the patriarchal dad, often has an appended A, which is decide, announce, defend, abandon, if you haven't really taken into account the stockholders. So that becomes a little bit more infantilized dad in any case. But cute stuff aside. So there's a second, headquarters that's now, I mean, this is all about Amazon's second headquarters out of Seattle, but instead of a single second headquarters, they began to talk about two. One in Queens, which fizzled, another one which was ultimately successful in Crystal City. And the reason that Alex and I think, found this so interesting is, which we got into this after we had researched and talked to a bunch of people and written a case on, on the Queen story, because it seemed, almost odd that, you have the governor and the state and 70% of the people and all these advantages, and the answer was no. How come? Something really must have happened, and I think we have a good account of that now. But we also have this, in many ways, apt comparison. And it really resides in the sort of moving force of this. One of the really key moving forces, there are more than one, was a guy named Stephen Murray, who Alex and I have spent a lot of time talking to. He was born in Mississippi. He went to LSU, then Harvard Business School, had a political career helping the Bobby Jindal, the Republican governor of Louisiana, with some of his campaigns. He was a CEO of a Chamber of Commerce. And along the way, he picked up a doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania in economic development, and he gets a job as Virginia's as the CEO of something called VEDP, which is Virginia Economic Development. And he had this new job at VEDP, Virginia Economic Development Program. There'd been a scandal. He had to sort of fix that. And if he wanted to do something, he would need statewide legislative support. And Virginia was pretty tight on financial incentives. They did not like to give tax breaks to industry. And also, if you had somebody like Amazon thinking about putting a major facility there, there was a lot of regional rivalry, which actually spilled over into animosity as between the regions. And also, if Amazon was going to come in with a big, a big facility, yeah, that's good, but it also means a lot of tech talent is going to be drawn from to there and away from existing businesses. So there was an ambivalence about, existing tech businesses, particularly the ones that weren't really big, like the big defense companies and so forth, and also high cost of living in the DC metro area, and just collectively in Virginia, this sense of we can't compete. I mean, and Stephen Moret, the kind of protagonist in this story, faces this time and time again. Legislatures say, why should we spend any money trying to attract Amazon? It's not going to work. It's just not going to work. And so he does a bunch of stuff. He hires McKinsey and tries to figure out how the strategic plan that he's been developing at the Virginia Economic Development Agency, how could the Amazon headquarters bid deal with this? And they analyzed tens of thousands of data points on LinkedIn and so forth, including like all the people who work in the Seattle headquarters at Amazon, to kind of understand their employment base and the company's needs and what it was really looking for in a new headquarters. He gets $1 million from the Virginia governor and targets three metro areas as possible sites. Richmond, which was in the center of Virginia, Hampton Roads, which is in the southeast, and Northern Virginia, which is adjacent to Northern Virginia next to Washington, D.C. And it's an interesting question. Why would you develop three regions? And I mean, Alex, when we were puzzled by this, do you remember kind of what his rationale was?
Yeah, I think that, he was keenly aware, right, that he's a newcomer and that it's very easy to be pigeonholed, I think, as being seen to be in favor of a certain area or another area. And that there's also obviously longstanding concerns in industry and communities and all over the place because the state's got a number of major metropolitan areas with robust industry presence, with world-class universities. But the DC area often gets a lot of attention, and that kind of it could appear to be favoritism. But I also got the sense from Stephen this really nice idea that because he was developing a broader plan and really concerned about the economic development of the whole state, that getting these areas to come together and start thinking about how the state could have different vibrant areas that could put in for something like this. Like you're saying, this we can't be the ones to put in
And
for
he
this kind
very
of
and
thing.
he very honestly worked with these three different areas to
Yeah,
develop proposals for Amazon that really put their best feet forward,
right.
custom websites, videos, and so forth, that really he was a powerful advocate for each of the three, put their best foot forward, but let Amazon choose. So you had kind of a statewide, it wasn't just the DC metro area begging for money from the state to set up, a pitch, but they've got the whole state, and there's attractive elements of it. So they end up raising a bunch of money for it.
I
And
also think there's a statewide concern there that unified all of them, right? Like his
yeah,
thing about, I think what he found in that study with McKinsey leading up to everything that was concerning everybody is Virginia was producing an enormous amount of tech talent, but it was losing that talent.
it's going
And,
to
and
Silicon Valley, it was going to New York, it was going to, lots of, Boston, lots of other places, Cambridge specifically.
yeah, and that seemed to be a statewide problem.
And so you know, he had a lot of challenges in this, to persuade state legislatures to view money trying to attract Amazon. Now we know that it succeeded, but at the time they didn't. And they said, why are they, with these other places begging for Amazon that are already tech hubs, whether it's, Boston or whether it's, Chicago or what, and it was tough to sort of figure out how to do this. And so he had to figure out kind of the support that he needed, and he needed financial buy-in so that he could, begin to develop really detailed proposals that would be necessary. And so he and his team do meetings with higher education leaders, interviews with other big tech employers in the state, like Capital One and Northrop Grumman and so forth, to kind of hear their concerns, because they might have been rivals for this, saying that, gee, Amazon's going to suck their best talent. And instead, they began to say, look, if we do this in the context of a statewide economic and technical development plan, this will generate a lot more tech talent. And, involving a bunch of other employers in the process gave them a lot of goodwill. And it also, with the sort of buy-in of a lot of the business community in Virginia, when the state legislature started complaining about, hey, this is going to cost us a lot of money and we don't know if we're going to win and so forth, he could use the business support to address some of those concerns and say, this is a very worthwhile investment for the state of Virginia. And so they really said, this is an investment in demonstrating to business leaders that they put serious effort into keeping Virginia competitive, even though they didn't think it was going to work. And, he really pushed at it. And he sort of said, how are we going to do this? Because we can't match the financial offers of other competitors. And that was partly because Virginia was smaller, but primarily Virginia just didn't do this as a matter of policy. They had tax incentives, but nothing like. So, for example, Maryland was offering 8.5 billion in tax incentives. New York had offered 3 billion. Virginia just wasn't going to do this. So, Alex, how did they even think they had a prayer of competing here?
I'm always struck by their sense of kind of destiny in this, but it was backed by significant research, right? And I think they really had grabbed onto the ideas of this seminal figure, and Murray had done this years earlier, of this guy Enrico Moretti, who's a really influential academic and scholar about this, who said, well, let's look at these things a different way. And Moretti was a voice when these bids first started going out, right? Of like, don't just offer incentives. Try to think about what the ecosystem looks like when you're bringing in tech and you're trying to build something out. And what Moretti had found, of course, was this really, really powerful kind of synergy almost in places like Silicon Valley, because he was concerned, like, what do you do with the high cost of living? How do people stay in these places? How do you create a community that can thrive with tech in it rather than tech just dominating it? And he found that there were really persuasive things about education and investing in education. There were really persuasive things about the number of jobs that each tech job can create if you do this correctly. It was a kind of benefit strategy of like, how does this benefit the whole community that aligned very well with what Murray was putting forward and happened to align well, I think, also with a lot of the economic development figures in each of these regions, right?
Yeah,
And that
because
was
he
put
said,
that forward.
education is key, tech, a tech pipeline, infrastructure in the state, and transportation. And so, the idea of tax incentives to sort of buy companies, he found was not nearly as powerful. And Virginia took this to heart, and that, and Stephen Moray had this economic development plan, which he modified, but already had a significant tech talent investment program to invest literally more than $1 billion in tech education, especially in computer science, on the new tech campus of Virginia Tech, but that would connect other universities in the region. And, so Virginia ended up submitting, 3 bids for 10 sites, and they coordinated very closely with the economic development people in each of the regions, and basically said, let's get each of our regions to put their best foot forward, and we're going to let Seattle choose. So we kind of built a coalition of hopeful parts, and these were realistically hopeful. They weren't long shots, but in any case, and so you remember of the 238 would-be contenders, in January of 2018, Amazon said, okay, here's 20 finalists, including the National Landing, which was in Crystal City in the DC metro area. And then, there's a lot of site visits by Amazon, and how do we, and Stephen Moray sort of said, how do we keep our coalition together? How do we get statewide support for this? How can we persuade Amazon that we kind of get what they need? And then there's some other, regulatory issues that were challenging. But, there was another piece of this story, which is across the Potomac in Pentagon City, Potomac Yards, and Crystal City, there was a big amount of real estate that was all in the hands of a company called JBG Smith, which was, recently merged with another big real estate company. And it had been home to thousands of military jobs, which in the early 2000s were basically lost with some military cuts. And so that area had easy access to public transport. You could add a footbridge to National Airport. It was, there was an area that you could create a highly walkable urban campus, and there was just parks and such were right there. And you had another guy. There was Stephen Moray, but there was a guy named Victor Hoskins, and you talked to him extensively, Alex. Why don't you just kind of get a sense of him?
I think that alignment just really proved that the connection between Murray and Hoskins is a real example of that close-knit communication with all these different economic development figures across the state. Hoskins had come from Maryland. He had been a major public servant, a secretary of economic development. Then he'd been in DC, so he knew how DC worked on development. And I think fundamentally shared Murray's sense that we're not going to offer tons of incentives, that there are other ways, tons of tax incentives. There are other ways to reach out to and tailor a relationship where the public and government and the general region get something out of this as much as the company. And I think that alignment really played off. Hoskins said to me that he told his staff be respectful to these folks, listen to what their really deep concerns are. And I think JBG Smith as well, like this involved flying to Seattle and scoping things out, really thinking sensitively about like when Amazon would come to tour DC, we're going to put them right on the metro right away so that its executives can see what this looks like. And I think that sort of sense of comfort and trust in presenting what the region looked like in reality, what you're going to get if you're Amazon and you come
And
here
Victor
was.
Hoskins basically said, this is a direct quote, we're not buying this deal.
That's right. We're
We
not
need to
buying
do
this
this
deal.
the way we do it, the right way. We want to focus on infrastructure, education,
Right.
transportation, because our community can deliver on that, and the community won't be upset because we need those things anyway. And fundamentally, Amazon doesn't need to be bribed with money. They need these needs met, and that's more interesting. And I think, the broader negotiation point is a lot of times people who think of themselves as very practical say, hey, it all comes down to price, and here's a bidding war, and so we got to bid more to win. And yes, but, and here's, I think, an interesting example. You've got
And
to
I think in that it boiled down to these two things, right? They were able to discover that what Amazon really wanted was that they were frustrated with Seattle and the feeling that they were being treated as though they had not contributed as much as they felt they had to the community. They wanted to be welcomed into a business community, not to dominate a business community and transform DC. And at the same time, I think that DC and Murray and Hoskins were very transparent about the idea that they wanted them to contribute in a really sustainable way to this idea of developing this tech talent pipeline over time. Having those two things on the table is very different, right, than this idea we came in with of offer a tax incentive and allow you to do whatever you want to do.
And you had another figure in this because you've got Victor Hoskins, you've got Stephen Murray in DC and Northern Virginia, economic development types. And then there's a business site leader, a guy named Matt Kelly, who was the CEO of JBG Smith, which is a real estate company. He'd been a faculty member here at Harvard Business School, was now in this very interesting real estate job. He said, we got to figure out how to be flexible and really meet Amazon's needs. So they went to Seattle. They acted as a host to to Amazon. And when somebody came to kind of spec it out, he did a lot of research on it and found that this guy really was a wine connoisseur and loved a sort of a boutique Oregon winery. And so at the welcome dinner, they served wines from that winery. And the guy was amazed. He said, where'd you even find these? They're hard to get in Seattle. And, Matt said, well, we understood that you liked them. So we thought it would be a, pleasant thing. And, anyway. And then they dug into it. What does the Amazon want? And well, Amazon has made Seattle rich or helped to make Seattle rich. There's a lot of animosity there. And that chafed with Amazon. They wanted to be loved, but they also their process needed secrecy in order to, tee things up. And they really, according to the book that well, in line with the book of Enrico Moretti that Alex talked about, they were looking for tech talent. And as Hoskins said, Amazon was looking for a welcome mat. They wanted to know that we welcome business growth, energy, innovation, creativity, and they weren't looking for somebody to give them the keys to the city. So they sort of picked up on the intangible things. And I have to say, this is a common thing in negotiation. People focus on the term sheet and the spreadsheets. And those are, I would say, almost necessary, but rarely sufficient. I say almost because sometimes people do stuff that doesn't quite fit with economics. But so here you have a real estate company, you've got two economic development types, and they work together and they coordinate closely with Amazon. Then they have about 50 Q&A sessions and local meetings. So they're getting a lot of stakeholder involvement. It's not just sort of a top-down thing, but they post recordings of those meetings. There's a big FAQ where lots of the issues are, linked to kind of questions. And they work very closely. JBG goes to Seattle multiple times. And Matt Kelly, JBG's head, he's determined to be welcoming to Amazon. And I'd mentioned the wine thing, but Jeff Bezos had a fundraiser for David Rubenstein for a charity cause, and he bought, and Kelly on behalf of JBG bought 5 seats at Jeff Bezos's table for 100,000 each, and offered to pay 150,000 more if he could make a 2-minute speech, which really would talk about the complementarity of this. So, they're working at the top, but then a lot of community coordination, and they were selected, right? So you have this very different situation. But as you might guess, that right away, the Arlington County Board in Northern Virginia, there are people who say, wait a minute, we don't like Amazon one bit. And the contentious hearings, and somebody actually is physically dragged out of the hearing. But because of all of this local preparation, Amazon had agreed in advance to pay prevailing wages, which was higher than the minimum wage, to protect against something called wage theft, which is a lot of ways that companies can sort of take advantage of what looks like higher wages but aren't never. So you were never really get organized opposition in this situation. And the goal was to add 25,000 new jobs to this area by 2030. And these were jobs that would all pay, ultimately it turned out well more than $150,000 each, with very big benefits and so forth. So this was not Amazon warehouses. This was Amazon headquarters, talented people. I mean, tech talented people and so forth. So how'd this play out, Alex?
Well, they at the local level they got it through, and I think that they've been able to develop since is that Virginia Tech campus, GW campus over there that are building out that tech talent end of things, and I think interestingly, we've seen in these years since you can hear all of you like we're excited about this stuff. I always have in the back of my mind, depiction is not endorsement, but this is a really, really impressive sort of set of things, because I think that where incentives were such a focus originally, we can come back around to that a little bit. In the years since, Amazon hasn't been able to fulfill all of the jobs there, right? But they have fulfilled thousands, and thousands and thousands and thousands.
And to
And
be
this
fair, a lot of the reason for that was COVID.
totally COVID,
It's
right?
just really, that I don't think anybody could have seen the delays and the problems that would cause, but it was
No.
pretty clear that they were doing as best they could, and they got back on track, but with a delay on the
That's
employment.
right. And the way they structured that deal, and I don't think Amazon has expressed any dissatisfaction that we could find with this any more than the state, who wouldn't be dissatisfied, is they structured it in a way where that hasn't then cost the state anything on they did offer some incentives. They were much lower than any of the other areas we looked at. But they haven't had to pay anything out, and in return, they've gotten the steady revitalization of this area that was basically an abandoned Defense Department part of town in a very central, rich environment. They've gotten some financial support on affordable housing, and I think really steadily started to build up a neighborhood there, right? And I
Yeah.
think that outcome is pretty impressive across the
And I
board.
would notice that, as Alex said, Virginia was not going to sort of buy this deal, but they certainly did have financial incentives. But the incentives, unlike in New York, they were very carefully specified and contingent on strict performance requirements for construction and employment growth. And, as of June of last year, Amazon hadn't gotten a single dollar of state incentives because they hadn't met all of those guidelines. So it wasn't seen as a sort of a giveaway,
Yeah.
particularly to a company of this kind. And, Amazon does other things. One, huge proponents and huge opponents of, major data centers in Virginia. And then they develop a partnership with Virginia Tech. They open the first, it's this $1 billion, I mean, seriously, $1 billion innovation campus, which was essentially adjacent to the second headquarters, but it was in Alexandria. And, more than 500 graduate students are initially involved. George Mason University, which is just 3 miles away, they open a 345,000 square foot facility for tech education, and there's a partnership with Amazon there. So you're getting this, government, business, academic, industry cooperation that is hardly, without friction, but you can see the benefits that collectively come from that. And, the average annual employment earnings from the Amazon, people who were there were originally projected to be about 150,000, and it's turned out that they're way higher than that, which obviously has economic development and tax implications. So Alex, if we were going to say, what should you take away? Because you have this really unusual situation. You have roughly comparable in the sense of same company, same time frame, East Coast. Queens and Crystal City are very different, but what can we take away from this that generalizes beyond Amazon, where you have these significant initiatives with a lot of stakeholders and a lot of controversy? What should folks who are interested in that take away from this sort of paired comparison?
I think right away my mind goes to interests, right? And aligning your sense of what the interests of all of the stakeholders involved are. Part of that involves seeing all the stakeholders that are involved. I think in that New York process, what we can see there is this top-down kind of approach doesn't see all of the folks who potentially could see themselves as being part of that story, let alone seeing what might incentivize them to want to get on board. And I think that, it even shows with the Amazon part of it in the aftermath of this, where the incentives have kind of dropped all the way into the backdrop with Crystal City. That's I think the biggest thing that I take out of it. The stakeholders in Virginia understood what they wanted to get out of this deal, how not to sacrifice that, but to make it seem like an opportunity to build that vision. And they made a significant effort to really understand, why is Amazon doing this? Why do they want to be here? Why would they want to be here? And similarly, why would all of these other stakeholders want them here or not want them here? And I
And
think
New
that's
York, New York basically offered $3 billion in tax breaks. Northern Virginia didn't really do that. They placed emphasis on, intensive tech education, infrastructure, workforce development, and and they were aided by a very creative and willing partner in the real estate firm, JBG Smith. And they worked really closely together to be extremely welcoming, just to be in contrast to the New York reception that they got and the kind of sour relationships in Seattle between the community and Amazon. And so focusing on your interests, both economic and non-economic, is the most basic lesson in negotiation, but it's pretty easy for sophisticated people to kind of miss it. I think the second big lesson is to coordinate top-level political backing with bottom-up stakeholder engagement. Because in New York, they went right for the governor and the mayor and some polls. And top down, once you had controversy, as you can almost predict would have been the case, as opposed to Northern Virginia, which had top down and bottom up, and that led to a very different pieces. I think the other piece, Alex mentioned, decide, announce, defend. Be careful of that. As powerful as you may be, and as useful, by the way, a lot of times I'm doing a commercial deal. I figure out what I want to do. I tell people what I'm going to do, and I just do it. And if there are not a lot of stakeholders, and the people on the other side are more or less familiar with this, then it kind of works. But in a situation with outside stakeholders, that may not work at all. And the Northern Virginia process, there's no way they were going to get full consensus, but you could build a sufficient, what you might call, winning coalition. And so, I think there are a lot of, a deeper understanding of interests, not going with decide, announce, defend, but a very different stakeholder-oriented process, top down and bottom up, and sort of a collaborative approach can be, much, much better. But, if you're in a complex multi-party setting, don't just assume that the benefits, the thousands of jobs and the billions of dollars of economic development and tax money and so forth, that not is going to guarantee victory. You want to monitor local cross currents and figure out who your potential allies are, who likely and potential opponents are. Be careful about opponents for very diverse reasons, joining forces to try to block you, and listen to potential opponents, and can you address their concerns? And but also remember, this is not a one-off. It's not a yes, you win this site, but it's yes, and you're going to need ongoing support for implementation sustainability. So it's two full long case studies, an article that you guys can read lots more than you may want to, And but we'd be happy to take questions or elaborate more fully on on this really quite remarkable story that gives you something that case studies very rarely do, which is a degree of legitimate comparability of very different approaches in similar situations.
Wow. Thank you too. This has been really incredible. And I had read the article, but it's like a page turner of a case study. Is this going to happen? What's going to happen next? Oh, and they bring out the wine. I mean, you could write an entire negotiation textbook over the principles that we're talking about here, starting with preparation, 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 which the Virginia team clearly had in spades, all of that deep research and thought that went into that process. So thank you. This is really fascinating. And we have put the link in the chat to the article again for everyone who would like to read further and investigate all of this. And there's a lot of great research and theory that, is behind everything that we're seeing today. So we've got a couple of great questions, and I'll start with one from Jim Tull. Critical moments of influence. Based on these two case studies, what are some critical moments that could be anticipated in big future state economic development opportunities? And what are a couple of things that local and state governments commonly forget to do in order to increase their influence in these moments? So some lessons that you could take away for various states in future similar situations.
Well, there's some critical moments, but most of them for Amazon were unexpected and unwelcome. And I think when you're doing something like this with a lot of stakeholders, you should expect opposition and anticipate it and build strength among your supporters, not to overwhelm your opponents, but to begin to listen to them and meet their needs. Because if it looks like you're just moving in as the big fish, it's you're going to generate a lot of pushback. So anticipation would have been possible in New York and was possible and was carried out beautifully in Northern Virginia. Alex?
What you're saying makes me think right away of also that I think being aware of how the process changes on very, very critical fundamental things that come to mind that Amazon felt, and I think for probably justifiable reasons, that the initial parts of this process needed to be highly secretive. And so it was very, very quiet. That shifted over time, and there was a point at which public engagement became a necessary component of actually getting this over the line. And I think they learned a hard lesson about that shift from the private to the public in Long Island City that people should be mindful of. Whereas I think it may have been Stephen or Victor said to us, the moment that this was announced in that Crystal City was picked, they had a website ready to go. They had information out there for the public. They were prepared to start to engage with constituents and answer questions. And I think being mindful of those shifts is that was a critical moment in this, and it was something that I think they shepherded very well.
And it wasn't just having good answers to likely objections, because they
Yeah.
did have those and they put them up on a website, but they also had about 50 community engagement settings, where they didn't say this is the plan, now react to it. They said we're planning to do something like this, give us your reaction. And then they sort of built up and they could use the input from that, and which I think affected what they did to some extent as well. But it was the process as well as the substance of the questions and the answers.
Yeah.
Mm, mm. We have a question from Stephen Einstein, who is in the New York region and lamenting what he felt was a loss, saying that many folks feel that this was a loss for the region, and is wondering, was there an opportunity for New York to course correct midway through? So, okay, things got off to a start and then AOC and, did you identify, key points at which something, some other lessons could have been brought in, or there could have been a change midstream in order to bring this back on track?
100%, 100%. And Alex can elaborate on this, but the one of the most telling aspects of this was when Amazon decided to pull out. An open letter in the New York Times was published from the mayor, the governor, a whole bunch of construction unions, a lot of other, teachers unions, NGOs, public interest groups, neighborhood groups that all signed this thing, said, please reconsider, we really want you. And what that tells us is Amazon generated support too little and too late. Whereas they just felt like the aggregate value of this, all this economic development, all this tax revenue, all this employment would kind of sell itself. And they didn't do the hard work of building alliances and supporters, which they were in profusion, um, along the way without even announcing, here's our big plan, but not being secretive about it, because that's inevitably going to generate a lot of suspicion. So we're thinking about this. We want to do it in a way that really works. What are you concerned about? Is it infrastructure? And, is it going to be congestion? Is it going to overwhelm the subways? Is it going to what? And then begin to deal with those.
I couldn't agree more. I just think that to end up being seen as an outsider in New York, this global destination where everyone is welcome, is the idea. Is it means that you've made some really some choices that have really gone off course. I'm a big believer that political communications can be highly effective in negotiations, and I think that there were many places along the way here where they could have course corrected long before needing an after the fact letter in the New York Times saying, please come back.
And there's the pitches that you can make and the answers and so forth in the events. Reportedly, we haven't confirmed this with Amazon, but someone very close to the process said Amazon never had a single person on site in New York the whole time. And you could imagine for something like this, ideally, you would want a team, because can you imagine, all the ethnic and other diverse cross currents in a place like Queens, probably more than almost any place in the country, picking up on these, advanced intelligence, figuring out what people are hopeful for, worried about, and then, go forward in knowledge of that rather than seeming to say, we're just going to do this. And also New York is a feisty place, so you should kind of know that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Question from our colleague David Hoffman. To what extent was Virginia's understanding of Amazon's interest based on explicit disclosure by Amazon or careful discernment by Virginia, or both?
Oh, the discernment was good. It's a really, really interesting thing. And I think that goes to another one of these critical decision moments. And Jim, I'd be curious where else you see this in the process. But it makes me think of, they announced this in September of 2017. Moray gets the letter from Amazon. He's just finishing up this massive economic development planning process. He has a McKinsey team there. He decides right away that he's going to keep that McKinsey team on if he can afford it, and try to persuade some state government officials to help fund this and help turn them toward doing some planning. And one of the simple data points that really leapt out to me about the kind of recon that they did on this was, they went through every single LinkedIn profile that they could find publicly available on every single one of Amazon's employees in Seattle to try to figure
Their
out
headquarters.
their
In their
headquarters.
headquarters.
Yeah. Where do they work? What do they do? Like in what areas of the company do they work? Where don't they work? What does the company seem to need? What are they earning? Where do they live? What are their interests? They developed a massive profile to try to aggregate that understanding of what they were in community as a headquarters already to start to shape up those regional plans.
And as they began to partner with JBG, the real estate firm, and you had the economic development entities and then some industrial partners helping with this, they sent people to Seattle to talk to Amazon. And when Amazon came, they really probed. So it was and of course Amazon didn't have any real interest in hiding what they needed. I mean, they didn't, and it just turned out there was a lot of fortuitous stuff, because this had been an old military site that had been, basically, I don't want to say abandoned, but it had been shifted elsewhere. But there were some really powerful like data capabilities that were still there, and things that, once Amazon learned, it made it even more appealing of that particular site. And it was a big site, and the real estate company was able to have control of the land, which was very appealing, and was willing to sell it to Amazon, which a lot of real estate companies in this business will rent, long-term rent, 30 years or something of this kind. And they were basically willing, we'll just sell it to you. And they didn't actually want to, but they knew Amazon having that control, feeling that control was important. And so they said, we're going to sort of abandon our standard practice because we know this is important to them. So we'll just do it.
Mm, mm. I think we're coming probably to our last question, which I will say. So a lot of these negotiations played out in the public eye, right? And a lot of these negotiations were carried out in a very public way. We are here offering this, and so there are witnesses. But there was also a whole, I'm sure, undercurrent of private behind the scenes. What do you think was the balance there? And were there any surprises that you uncovered in those backroom negotiations? that you were surprised to learn, given that you'd been able to view what was happening over the course of, public newspaper reporting and announcements throughout the course of these times?
I think there's quite a lot that we weren't able to pick up, but I think there was enough, having talked to enough of the people who were involved, that we have a pretty good sense of the story. And there was never any kind of rabbit pulled out of a hat that said, "Oh, that's how they did it." It was, a pretty significant, pretty basic match between what Amazon really cared about. And once Crystal City had figured out what Amazon's interests were and how to meet them, it kind of meshed. I don't think there was anything sort of black magic or dark side. Now, I'm sure there were plenty of behind the scenes things, but I don't think that was fundamental in this outcome.
I couldn't agree more. I think it largely was an honest representation, I think, on on Virginia's part of what their position was, and a desire not to hide things behind the scenes because it could be so toxic. I think that in doing the research, I mean, we certainly found things that were of interest, but I think maybe a telling sign of why it's hard to keep something that would be so fundamental to the success of this secret, and this is the contrast, of course, with New York, is just the endurance test that this was. You ask every figure who was involved in this, and the one distinct thing that made this different than many of the large negotiations they were used to of this kind, it went for so long. It went for so long. They were exhausted by the end of it. And I think that trying to keep anything really substantially secret through that would have been very, very difficult for them to do. There were little things here and there, certainly public criticisms that are fair about certain small aspects of the process, but nothing that I saw that was really a linchpin for it.
So if I just said, looking at this, three quick things to keep in mind. I mean, it's sort of negotiation 101, right? Focus on the full set of interests, tangible and intangible. Amazon wanted to feel welcomed. They wanted, there was a series of things beyond that. Second, coordinate top level political backing with bottom up stakeholder engagement. You really want to work both sides of this. And then just be awfully careful of what sometimes works in commercial settings where there are only a couple of parties. Decide, announce, defend, dad, sounding pretty patriarchal, as opposed to decide, announce, defend, abandon. A consultative process, at least to some degree, typically gives you a much greater chance of success in these multi-stakeholder, diverse sets of interests, situations. Not all, but under those circumstances. And I think this is one which really shows the contrast. Again, it's an unusual situation. You have you've got the same company, the same kind of project, same coast, same time, and radically different interests, radically different outcomes. And of course, there are big differences between the two places. But what stands out to us is how Amazon negotiated in the two places. And one decide, announce, defend, abandon. The other, consult carefully, do. You're very clear about what you want to do and what your interests are, but a very different process. And I think they were very happy with the outcome.
Mm. Well, thank you for ending on those key takeaways, Jim. And thank you to both of you, Jim and Alex. What a fascinating discussion. Once again, we're putting the links to the article in the chat. The recording of today's event will be up by early next week at the latest on the PON website. So if you'd like to share it with somebody, or come back to view a point that you missed, we're so grateful to our speakers for their time today. And we do have a number of events coming up, as I mentioned at the outset, over the course of the spring. We've put up for you both the links to the negotiation journal and PON publications generally, as well as our next 4 upcoming events. But we are scheduling things every minute, it seems. And all of the teaching and learning opportunities, our PON programs that we are conducting both online and in person here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So we hope to engage with many of you over the course of an event or a class during the semester. Wishing everyone a wonderful rest of their day and week. Thank you again, and we will see you soon.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thank
Thanks so much,
you.
Nicole.
Thank you.